So having moderated a lot of panels, one thing I've learned, and I just proved it in my last panel, is that I'm fully capable of butchering people's names and what they do, even if I've studied the sheet ahead of time. So I outsource that to the individuals who are on the panel. So if we can take these 5, we're good here. So essentially, if we can start with you, Gordon, you can introduce yourself and say what you do at ISO New England, and then we'll pass the baton down the row, and then we'll start the conversation after, say, 3 or 4 minutes of each of you essentially indicating what you're doing, what's the problem you're trying to solve, and where you think this conversation can go.
Great. Thanks very much for inviting me. My name's Gordon Van Welie. I'm the CEO of ISO New England, which is the grid operator and the wholesale market operator up in the 6-state New England region. I think there's an interesting story to tell about New England. We're a highly restructured marketplace. The region decided to require its utilities to sell off all their generation some 15 years ago. And since then, we've been through a pretty dramatic transformation, and the transformation is accelerating. So I sort of think about this as 3 waves of change. The first big wave of change was the shift into natural gas. And what we've seen is natural gas come on really strong in the last 10 years, and it's really displacing a lot of the older, more traditional resources like coal, oil, and now even nuclear. So just a massive fuel shift really on the system. And what it's created is a need for more natural gas infrastructure. So the second big wave of change is the shift towards renewables. So the states in New England have very progressive policies with regard to carbon reductions and renewable energy targets, want to reduce carbon emissions economy-wide by 80% by 2050. And so we've seen a big push into renewable energy. And we've also seen the emergence of huge investment in behind-the-meter infrastructure, energy efficiency, demand response over the last decade or so, in part driven by the capacity markets that we put in place. And the renewable energy drives a need for investment in transmission to enable moving this renewable energy to where it's actually consumed. And I think the third big shift that we're starting to see now is the shift into distributed energy resources with massive investments in solar panels and now storage. So I think we're on a track towards a hybrid grid. So I could see we're already at about 10% of our resource coming from behind the meter. I could see that within the next decade it'd be 20% plus. So that has pretty profound implications for us from a wholesale market perspective, but also from an operational point of view.
Sounds like fun. Todd.
Great, thank you, Peter. My name is Todd Staples. I'm president of the Texas Oil and Gas Association. I'm glad to be on the stage with Peter, so I'm not the only guy here with an accent today. The Texas Oil and Gas Association represents all facets of oil and gas in Texas. Our member companies include, obviously, upstream production, refining, pipeline companies, service companies. Our members produce about 90% of the oil and gas that's produced in the Lone Star State today. Very excited about the role that they're playing in developing a nation with a higher level of energy security, an unprecedented level of energy security. Prior to being in this capacity, which I joined in the end of 2014, I served as the Texas Commissioner of Agriculture, statewide elected position for 8 years, and then served as a member of the Texas House and Texas Senate working on public policy issues. So I'm glad to be here with you today. Look forward to a good discussion with people that are making and finding good solutions for our country.
Thank you. Nick.
Well, my name's Nick Brown. I'm president, CEO of Southwest Power Pool. We're the regional transmission organization that serves all our parts of 14 states in the central U.S. up to the Canadian border and down to Texas. The biggest challenge facing us right now is wind penetration. Many years back, our region was kind of dubbed the Saudi Arabia of wind, and 10 years ago, I really didn't expect to see what we see today, and that's with over 12,500 megawatts of installed wind capacity, and of that 12.5, instantaneously, we have seen 10,500 of that on multiple occasions, 87% of the total installed, with a penetration exceeding 45% of our generation online at any given point in time. My biggest fear is our ability to monitor that in real time, because while we are in the process of deploying synchrophaser technology to really see what's happening within the cycle and ensure stable operation, we're not where I would like to be. We're working on that, but we're not where I'd like to be. So look forward to more conversation.
Thank you, and Mike.
I'm Mike Carlson. I'm the president for Siemens Digital Grid in North America. And my business consists of products, software, and services that hopefully address a lot of what you guys already teed up for us. We're looking at anywhere from solutions that meet the immediate need of operating the grid and the assets on the grid, integrating those for a better optimization result, and then all the components that, whether you've got a cybersecurity issue, anything that ties to the reliability and sustainability of grid operations. So we're doing that through, again, products and services, but ultimately as we're pulling together the digitalization of all of these different machines, we're looking at the software, the analytics, and the capabilities of presenting situational awareness to the decision makers. And it'll be interesting to see how much that decision making stays within the human desk or moves to the machine as we go forward. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So it struck me when we were talking about this, and how we were going to form that narrative arc, that so much of this has to do with markets. It certainly does, Todd, with natural gas. And with the fracking, you've been so successful, you're causing some problems for yourselves in one sense, but that's what markets do. And Gordon, when we had, 5 degrees below zero, a month and a half ago, we had 2 days of really cold weather in New England. We don't have enough gas pipelines. And being the perverse individual that I am, I saw that weather coming, and I was disappointed that it was going to be on President's Day on Monday, because it was a holiday, because I wasn't going to see the full impact of the price spike. But nonetheless, I went on the website that morning, the ISO New England website, which posts the locational marginal prices over on the lower right-hand side, if I can recall correctly. And the prices were about $127 per megawatt hour in the morning, like 8 o'clock. And I clicked on another half hour later, and I was delighted that they had slammed up to $279. And I was thinking, excellent, great market signal, good locational marginal pricing. And then I looked 20 minutes later, and they dropped right back down. We saw the market response we were supposed to see. When you and I were talking about this, you discussed the challenge of dealing in a situation where you've got gas out there, but not the infrastructure to bring it in. You've got an environmental lobby and politicians who want to decarbonize, and you've got a market that's also moving towards decentralization, but your responsibility is to make sure that all the pieces work and that there is a marketplace. How do you deal with that on a day-to-day basis, and what are the biggest challenges in the conversations you're having with your constituents to make sure that the informed decisions are happening?
Wow.
It's a big problem.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
So how many hours do we have for this?
Yeah.
So I guess at a physical level, I would just say that the thing that's going to help us balance the system for the foreseeable future is natural gas.
Yeah.
So we're going to we have phased out most of the coal and oil, some of the nuclear is leaving, and the region wants to utilize renewable resources to produce as much energy as possible, but of course those are going to be weather dependent. So really the big battery that we've got is the gas system, and it's converting gas into electricity. So at a physical level, that's sort of one of the basic things that we have to get right in New England if we're going to remain viable on this path. The other sort of big conundrum, though, is the wholesale markets were set up on the premise that you would achieve resource adequacy through the market, at least the premise in New England. I think what people don't often understand is that when you look at these wholesale electricity markets, they're actually quite different in different parts of the country in terms of whether they're trying to solve for resource adequacy or not. Resource adequacy simply means having enough generation, enough supply to be able to meet demand on the long term. And for that to be possible, you need to have confidence in the market that a private investor is going to come along and build a generator based on recovering that investment through the marketplace. So here's the conundrum. So if you think about renewable energy and I've just said a few minutes ago that we want to move towards reducing carbon emissions by 80%. One of the characteristics of renewable energy is that it has no fuel cost. So it has very low variable cost. So what does that do to the energy market? Essentially, it takes all the revenue out of the energy market. But yet you want a whole fleet of gas generators to stick around and show up when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. So how do you pay for that? So there's really only two ways you pay for that. You either pay for that through a capacity market, or you end up having some other out-of-market construct, either cost of service or reliability contracts with the entire fleet. If you're doing the latter, you're no longer really running a market per se. So in the former instance, where you're trying to do it through the capacity market, having confidence in the capacity market and making sure that you get appropriate price formation in that market is fundamental to making it work. And yet what you often don't get an understanding of is the fact that as you push the energy prices down, you have to increase the revenues available in the capacity market for this fleet to remain viable.
To make them whole.
That's right. And so I think that's kind of the one of the big policy questions we're challenged with at the moment, because I think many policymakers don't understand that dynamic.
So, Nick, I was on the Southwest Power Pool site today, and I saw a couple hours ago, wind was at 19.7% of the gen fleet contributing right now, and I think coal was half, and nukes were pretty considerable as well. And you've talked about pulling in all this additional wind in the future because the resource is there, and you're the Saudi Arabia of wind, and Todd is actually producing more gas than Saudi Arabia right now, right? So Saudi Arabia is figuring big in this conversation. So if you've got a production tax credit, that's 2.3 cents a kilowatt hour. So even if prices are down at a penny or less, wind still makes money spinning and dropping electrons into the system. How do you, in the SPPP, how do you deal with that issue there? How do you incentivize the market and make sure that the other resources show up when they need to, especially when you're really going after this wind resource?
Well, our market prices are going negative, particularly during periods of high wind output and low load periods. Obviously, our wind producers know what their break-even point is and how negative they can go and how much they can pay to continue to produce. At the same time, we must keep a significant portion, particularly of our gas generation online, because of the variability of the wind. Without the tremendous resource of gas and the ability for it to help us regulate, we would be in significant trouble any number of hours of the year. As a balancing authority, we used to have a much easier job. Here was the load side of the equation, and we kind of treated it as this independent variable, and we would chase it with big, huge thermal machines. And today, that job of chasing the balance of load and generation has been compounded because even on the generation side, 19% of our capacity is also a variable and can change very quickly. The good thing for our operators, thanks to wonderful tools and software packages and data, is that our load forecasts have become very, very good. That has been kind of a saving grace, but at the same time, we have got to keep capacity online from the big thermal machines, primarily gas, in order to always constantly manage that balancing equation. And it gets tougher all the time. And if solar increases into the mix on the generation side, that's going to be another variable in the overall balancing equation that our operators are going to have to chase. So our tools are going to have to continue to advance. We're going to have to continue to coordinate with the gas industry as we become more dependent on gas as our primary boiler fuel. And we are seeing that transition. People have asked me about, so is the Clean Power Plan still a viable future in our planning scenarios? And I believe it is, whether the Clean Power Plan ultimately comes about or not. Our members were already moving in that direction in our footprint. It was just a matter of timing. Our big concern early on was how fast we were moving in that direction. But we were moving in that direction anyway, and we'll continue to do so.
So is the good news about wind for Todd that natural gas gen is the natural dance partner for wind for some time to come.
Very much so.
So you can sleep easy for a while.
My problems are some gone.
Okay, so, but when you're a huge producer of gas in this country, and obviously you can sell it for chemical feedstocks, there are LNG trains moving into operation, but still generation is the lion's share of a lot of the gas, and obviously for heating and so on. But how, when you're working with your constituencies, how much are you looking at those downstream uses and the changes and what's going on in the constituent elements of consumption across the U.S. and even now the global economy? How much does that factor into the conversation of your members?
Well, I think it's very much a big factor. You look at the global energy demand, and every forecaster continues to indicate it's going to grow.
Yeah.
And yet we have so much uncertainty in the market right now. We're at a relatively all-time low for oil and natural gas prices. So the demand has weakened globally while supply continues to grow. Supply has grown very simply because of the continued use of innovation and technology and the things that have made America the great country that we are today, and the oil and natural gas community has embraced that. You mentioned fracking early on. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people don't realize that fracking has been used successfully in this country for over 60 years. Over 1 million wells have been drilled successfully using fracking, and fracking was a person that would be drawing Social Security right now. It's been around that long. Fracking combined with horizontal drilling is really what has enabled this new renaissance of energy supply and energy security, this abundant supply of natural gas. So expanding markets, looking for new partnerships. I think whether you're in the oil and gas business or you're in the energy business of providing that energy, I think what I'm hearing is you need certainty. You need that stability for planning purposes. And we see policies coming from the federal level that disrupts that certainty and that planning capacity. That's what causes disruptions, and that's what causes higher prices for consumers.
That $2 an MMBTU price. I remember post-Katrina, when all the pipelines in the Gulf, many of them got broken. Some weren't even worth rebuilding because the reservoirs weren't there to bother reestablishing it. We look at $14 then, and our electricity prices in a place like New England were somewhere in the 14 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour range. That was a really volatile time. Now it looks like we're seeing flat for some time to come. Is that general view from your perspective? For prices?
Because the supply is so great right now.
It's unlimited, virtually,
It's
right?
virtually unlimited. I mean, you look at any of the plays across the United States, and our capacity for a national energy security is just unparalleled. And so until we are able to fully utilize that or continue to build the export terminals to expand that global marketplace that we can be viable and competitive in, most economists are not seeing anything immediately. Obviously, I wish I had that crystal ball. Yeah. I don't. But the thing I think that the general public doesn't understand, they may recognize that natural gas is a fuel that's being used to heat and cool their homes. But oil and natural gas is used in their tires in our cars. It's used in toothbrushes. It's used in medical devices. And so it's really very much a part of our national culture and the daily products we use. And while we want to see other forms of energy, our members are very much an all of the above approach. Whatever the market will work on and accept and can use is what they're for. Where they get uneasy is when the government starts picking winners and losers, and it creates the level of uncertainty. And then those additional costs that are just simply unnecessary that consumers have to pay.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a feedstock of low-price gas. We've got a mandate to decarbonize the economy. We've got storage coming on, and prices will fall by 50% over the next 5 years. Tesla's announcing its Model 3 tomorrow, so we'll see what happens there, but that's just storage on wheels. We've got all this wind coming in. We've got distributed energy resources, synchro phasers to tell you what's going on the transmission grid. This sounds to me like the biggest IT and digitization play that humanity's ever seen. Oh, there's someone here who might be able to help us with that. Mike, do you have any comments on how that plays out from the perspective of you and Siemens?
Yeah, I think you listen to all the opportunity, if you will, that's being presented to us, combined with the objectives, clean energy, sustainable energy, reliable energy. And what we're looking at is not only how do you operate these machines, but how do you optimize them? And I think that's the one difference in what we've seen in the past on the grid, is that while there's been a lot of machines, regularly referred to as the most complex machine in the world, that machine is operated at a relatively consistent expectation. It has the components that fail unexpectedly, but the supply and the demand has been able to be mapped pretty regularly. You know, one of my first introductions into this industry was the excitement at a utility that we announced updating the model. And I'm a new guy. Well, this is a big deal. We're celebrating what a 6-month update of the load forecast model. And I said, great. What's the new answer? Well, it's .0026 different from the last update. And so now we've transitioned to not only all the opportunity, but all the new variables that have been added to the system. And it's not only the variables that have been added, wind, solar, PV, fuel sources, but the frequency in which that variability is moving around, both on the supply and distribution side of the equation, but also on the demand. You look at, to the point, Tesla's going to announce the new Model 3, 2, 3 in the garage. 5 years ago, the common answer at the utility was, we'll go hang a new transformer. It's the easy way, it's the quick way, it's the cheap way. But now as these things start to introduce more and more variability, it no longer can be the human and the physical response, but we need the digital response. So it's not only about enabling devices that can sense, collect, and communicate, but what do? We've got, the industry is real big on big data right now. Arguably, that data exists, and it's actually existed for a long time. It's what are we going to do with it? So it's the storage, the analysis, and the presentment of that information that is going to take us to the next level of optimization. The grid's going to work, but how can we optimize that grid? And Siemens and our strategy is clearly around the digitalization of all the devices, the analysis of that digital data, and then presenting the options initially to the human side, but the variables and the frequency and the time, we've quickly exceeded the ability of the human to decide. We now need to move it to the machine with the human monitoring management overall.
So we'll have to make those devices market aware to know grid conditions and know prices, and if they have internal elasticities, take advantage of those price responsive functions. Do you see it going there?
Yeah, not only market aware, but market intelligent. If you look at where are the different variables that can be tapped into, used to be a handful, now it's a multitude of, and they have a much lower granularity or fidelity on the grid. We're going to have to enable that capability in conjunction with market. And you look at what the market priorities are, they can be economic, they can be sustainable, they can be reliable, they can be environmental. All those things are going to come together into an increasingly complex model that's going to have to be determined, which choice do I make?
Just to add on to this, we were talking over lunch about the technology and the modeling and the big data and the ability to use all of that data in a predictive fashion and in an optimization way. I think there are two huge impediments, though, and one is just the regulatory structure to allow organizations like myself to manage on the demand side of the equation. In our 14-state footprint, we have no retail choice states. We only operate the market at wholesale. Certainly, we can send signals to the wholesale operators that they can then move on the distribution side of the equation, but there's still huge regulatory pricing impediments and so on to turning that resource into something that we can manage. And then the other, cybersecurity. We keep putting ourselves so much more dependent upon big data and optimization and all of these things. And cybersecurity, quite frankly, is, earlier we were talking about, so what keeps us up at night? That's what keeps me up at night. As sophisticated and as robust as we think we are. In my view, my organization, for one, is now spending more time on recovering from as opposed to preventing. And I think that's sad. I mean, I really think over the last couple of years, moving from staying ahead and preventing penetration and working on recovery, I just hate that.
Yeah, that's a tough place to be.
Peter,
yeah.
I've got a thought that I'd like to throw in on top of what Nick said on his first point, which is I feel sometimes like I'm living in two universes, two parallel universes, because in the one universe we have this discussion around, and I'll use the buzzwords, transactive energy, distributed energy resources, markets for all of these devices, the Internet of Things. Have I left any of those buzzwords out yet? So this sort of vision of there's going to be this grid of things out there that's going to dynamically respond to some price signal, and it'll all stay reliable. And I see that future, at least with regard to distributed resources, coming at us quite quickly. But I think the technology side of this is arguably the easy part of the equation. The part that makes me feel like I'm living in a parallel universe sometimes is that there's no policy alignment between
Right.
what
Yeah.
people are expecting at the federal level and what's being done at the state level. And if we are truly going to rely on this resource base behind the meter to balance what's happening at the wholesale level, not just manage their own demand, but actually balance what's happening at the grid level, there has to be the same operational accountability behind the meter as there is at the grid level. There has to be the same financial accountability behind the meter as there is at the grid level. And that's not the system we're implementing at the moment. If you sort of look around, what's happening is this class of resource that's coming in behind the meter is essentially shielded from much of that operational accountability. And yet the argument is, hey, ISO, you don't have to buy 100 anymore. You now have to buy 80 at the wholesale level because you can just rely that this stuff is going to show up. And of course, Michael says, don't worry, I'm just going to connect it all up and network, and it'll just show up when you need it.
Plug it in.
But I look at it and say, well, how do I know that the person who's got that solar panel on their roof and that Tesla battery wall, how do I know they're actually going to make that available to me to balance the grid, or whether they're going to charge their vehicle to go to the store with at the moment that I need it?
And are they
So that's the problem we're not dealing with.
And are they going to become registered entities under NERC and subject to auditing
Exactly, yeah.
and fines?
And
And
the
set
cyber
standards at the same time.
To just sort of bridge across into the cyber world, right? So we're rushing around trying to build the walls and all the cyber security defenses at the wholesale level. What's happening at the retail level?
Yep.
It's basically a free-for-all. So I think the story doesn't line up for me in terms of what's possible. I accept that from a technology point of view. I'm an engineer. I love technical stuff. But the policy alignment doesn't match this other story we're creating. So I wonder about where do we go with that?
It's admittedly a very difficult question. Does pricing help it? Or so one of the things I grapple with is, and by the way, you were responsible for one of my darkest days at Constellation. Not you, but your team. And it went like this. Demand response, which I was responsible for, had 2 zones in New England. Maine and rest of New England. This is like 6 or 7 years ago. And then they decided that they needed more granular resources, which made a lot of sense. So they broke the next region into 5 regions, and I had a lot of performing resources in one region and a lot of resources that all of a sudden didn't exist in the other regions. So I'd been 100+% compliant, and suddenly I was in the high 60s, and I got called in front of management, and it was a dark day. It made sense, though. Where we were going was looking at the needs down at a more regional and a more granular level. And as we get more IT, more people like me are going to have those dark days. As we get to the point where potentially you know where the scarcity is at a particular node in the grid, or you see Texas with the nodal pricing now, do you see, Gordon and Nick, micro pricing environments potentially evolving so that that person does the right thing with the Tesla because they're incentivized to do it the right way, either automatically or not? Can that evolve within the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, I think the micro pricing is possible, but I wonder about whether it's only through the energy market. I think the problem with why I say that is think about price formation in the energy market. If you are relying purely on the energy market to drive the price signal, yet that price is being distorted because you've taken a whole bunch of resource that otherwise wouldn't be economic.
And subsidized
And
it,
you've
yeah.
subsidized it, you've put it in the energy market, you've depressed that price, and I can make the scenario worse. I'm going to go off and enter into a bunch of cost of service contracts to put distributed storage on the system. So what happens to your price signal when that happens?
Right.
So I think it's a really challenging environment. So I think the thing we're not facing up to is that if we're going to say to folk, we're going to pay you as if you're providing a service back to the grid, or we're going to incent you to go put in a solar panel and pretend that the value of that is sort of the full retail rate.
So net metering.
Net metering. So, but we're going to give you a free option to pull on the grid whenever you want. Well, who's going to pay for the grid?
That distorts it.
Yeah, so I think the problem is getting the price signal right across the board so that we really reflect the true marginal cost of reliability. So I don't see how we get a market with micro price signals to function correctly unless there's a correct price being formed at a wholesale level.
For everything.
For everything.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. It goes back to the policy debate. It's not a technological challenge. My favorite definition of the smart grid is one that EPRI started using many years back and then abandoned for some reason. I'm not sure why, but it was prices to devices.
Right.
And the point being, it takes the human out of the equation. All the devices have built-in decision-making authority, and that can all happen. Technologically, it is not a difficult problem, nor an expensive one, but the policies are not in place to support an infrastructure that allows that to happen. It's all about the price signals.
So Mike, your digital world, in one sense, would get a lot bigger if those policies could emerge in the right way. Is that
Exponentially.
okay? So does Siemens and do your competitors, can you join arms and have conversations with politicians and regulators, or is it something that you do explaining here's what needs to happen in order to open that whole brave new world up?
Yeah, and I would agree. I think our biggest barrier, while we might need to tweak technology, we need to optimize it, the biggest barrier right now is, and I'll be generic to stay on the good side of everybody, it's the business model. Whether it's politics,
Yeah, sure.
industry, consumers,
Yeah.
the business model is not enabling us to go to the next level of what technology is there for. I think to the point, this is not going to be a single, industry solution. It's not even going to be a single company solution. It's a combination of multiple factors. Siemens, from a partnership level, both with my competitors as well as my partners, are going to have to play into this. One of the things we've had a debate going on for years in this industry of very standardization in its history. How much of the standardization do we need before we're willing to adopt the business model? And the technology that's standard, I think that's probably one of the biggest shifts that we've embraced in the last couple of years, is looking at the agility of what can we do today that can be expanded and built upon tomorrow, instead of here's the solution for the day, let it run its course through the economic model of the industry, which is, even for technology, is 5 to 7 years out. That is also the impediment for moving forward. So how do we move with investments today that can continue to turn the agility of what we're going to figure out tomorrow is a key part. And I think you look at not only Siemens, but my peers in the industry, I think it's a growing recognition of it's not the version 6 that's released for the next X period of time, but how does 6 become 6 to 7 to 8, all within a much shorter time cycle than we're used to.
Do any other countries have better models?
Better economic incentives?
Or just better public policy, more informed, or things we can learn from that way? I mean, you're an international company.
I would say no.
Yeah.
I think every country has got different components that allow a different way of thinking but nobody's transformational in it. Nobody's given us a green field to play in. And I understand, this is where we need to put more, what I would say, macroeconomics and poli-sci expertise into our industry to recognize that, a monopoly does have certain constraints that have to be recognized in the market. But how do we enable that market to take risks like we have telecom? Best example to date.
I
Todd, you were gonna-
won't be as cautious as maybe Mike is about getting on the wrong side of it. What I'm hearing Nick and Gordon say is that policy decisions are making consumer costs more costly and more disruptive and more uncertain in providing energy to heat and cool our homes. I mean, it's very, very clear to me that a lot of these policies and decisions that you're having to make are inflicted by policy decisions that you're having to balance and deliver. And, I just think that consumers need to be fully informed about these policy decisions and how that drives cost and how it makes goods more costly to them. I think that needs to be a bigger part of the discussion.
But don't you,
Point taken, but-
don't you think it's some of it's unintended consequence in the sense that, I think if I speak to policymakers in New England, for example, they have a statutory mandate to do something about increasing renewable energy and reducing carbon emissions. This is not optional, it's not a goal.
But
They
that's a
have to
choice
do
that
it.
was made by policymakers, right? And when,
Exactly.
I mean, natural gas production has skyrocketed in the last few years. Methane emissions from gas production has been actually decreasing. And so my point is that we want an all of the above approach, and we want to use technology, and we want to use innovation to find these solutions. But policy choices and mandates by government have consequences that consumers ultimately pay the bill. And there just needs to be that full disclosure and how that's impacting them.
I'd go a step further if you'd
Yeah, sure,
allow me
please,
for a
please,
second.
please.
Because I think it's, there will always be policymakers. And policymakers will always want to make choices and will want to tilt the playing field in certain directions. I mean, it's always been that way. It always will be that way. I think one of the things we're struggling with is how to steer the conversation so that folk recognize how you do it is important as well in terms of whether the market can function. So in terms of achieving multiple policy objectives at once, if you're going to do this through a wholesale electricity market so you can get all these other wonderful things that we think is important, how one articulates this additional policy need, which is reducing carbon emissions, for example, or more renewable energy, is important. I'll give you an example to illustrate. If you do it through a mechanism which puts a price on the attribute you're looking for, but doesn't pick winners and losers in the marketplace, but you allow the market to bring you the attribute because you're paying for it, either through a price on carbon or some kind of
But that's
payment.
picking and choosing when you put prices.
That's tilting. That's called tilting the marketplace, right? As opposed to
It's picking winners and losers.
contracting
That's-
for specific resources, which would be much more around picking winners or losers. I think the problem we've got is there's an externality out there, and this differs.
Sure.
Whether you're in Texas or whether you're in New England or Washington State, there's going to be different views on this environmental attribute. So I think if we want to sort of move the system towards a place where the market can produce the attribute, there's a discussion on how to do that in a way that the market can best monetize it. And I think that's a very important discussion that we need to continue to have.
I think it is, but I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the unintended consequences. I mean, you look at the renewable fuel standard mandate that the federal government had. We're going to have a certain percentage, so many gallons of ethanol, then we're going to move to cellulosic ethanol, and we had people ramping up toward that. Oh, you can't produce that from cellulosic ethanol, and any kind of cost mechanism that makes sense. And that's where you get into trouble, I think.
That's what economists call perverse outcomes, right? So in a perfect world, then you would say, this is the social outcome I desire, and I would try and price the market in such a way that it moves that way, and the actors know what those signals are going to be long-term, so it's not like the ITC, which it's here for one moment, then maybe it goes away, and everyone starts, and it cripples the business model, and Mike's over there trying to figure out, is this thing going to be real or not? Whatever it is that's emerging, should we invest in it or not? and Nick's dealing with, you know, the PTC is going to be here and then it's not, and so he's got to figure out one moment, oh, it looks like I'm going to integrate this in and then not, and that's the challenge we're all dealing with essentially, right?
Absolutely.
So, but isn't the reality of the world that we're going to live in that world for a long, long time to come?
Well, I think the question to that, is it going to be a prescriptive model change?
Yeah.
Where we sit through the policy and the planning that says this is what we want to have the outcome to be, or is it going to be a disruptive policy change?
Right.
And disruptive is not going to follow policy, is my experience. Disruptive is going to force policy to follow it. And I'm a long-time utility guy. I land on the side of utility, but have we constricted them with so much policy that they're not able to be the innovators? And is it going to take the disruptors? You know, Google continues to be the, you know, center point of where I can see disruption occurring that would be generally outside the policy mechanism. And what happens to us then? What happens to the industry? And we talked at lunch again as we were debating this. Where's that crisis? Or we're very good in a crisis. We respond as a country, as a society, as, you know, technology in crisis. Do we have to have crisis to solve this problem? It's an open
And
debate.
do we take that to so far that we drive production and jobs continuously in other markets that are more competitive and that don't have the same policy goals as some policymakers might choose for? So I think that's a huge factor that the public really needs to focus on. I mean, do you want those billion-dollar plants built here, or do you want them built in India or China? And those are consequences of the types of policy decisions that are being made.
So we've got roughly 15 minutes left, and there may be people in the audience that had questions. Do we have a mic out there someplace, or? Great. Does someone want to ask a member of our distinguished panel a question? I've got plenty more in my head, but I want to give you all a chance.
Oh, would, sure.
Who do we have? Yes, you, sir. If you can stand up and identify who you are, would be great. And there's a mic coming to you right now.
All right, fabulous. Okay, great. I love the discussion about what incentives should be put into energy markets to make sure that we have, a level playing field for all resources. I think something that's kind of missing in this conversation is a little bit of insight into, how much incentives and government support the fossil fuel industry has gotten over the past 100 years. I just wonder, Mr. Staples, the rest of the panelists, what would a level playing field for energy look like, especially when we, all acknowledge, the existence of climate change, its harms, and, kind of know that we need to have some sort of policy prescription to deal with it. I just wonder, what does that level playing field look like to you guys? And I'm not trying to take a dig at you, Todd. Not at all.
Okay,
I'm really curious to see,
I think,
what you guys think.
I think it's a very fair question, a very appropriate question to ask. When you see government policymakers start discussing changes, you may have companies that are making investments and significant investments. They may be doing a deal with Siemens to develop new technology to meet a goal or objective, but when policymakers start discussing mandates or changes or percentages of the power grid that comes from one particular source or the other, sometimes that freezes those investments and it stalls any benefits that you might have becoming because the marketplace is responding to that. So I think that's a very cautious one. And so when you look at the mix of power generation, that's very concerning when you look at the different forms that are out there. And I think if we have policy that says it's an all of the above approach, and I think Gordon's right, you have policymakers that throughout the history of time shift one priority or the other, but if we don't forget that America was built upon a free market enterprise model that has given us the best opportunity for success, the best quality of life that we've ever seen, the best standard of living around the globe today, that's the way that we need to approach it and not be trapped into things like the renewable fuel standard and those that create those disruptions, just is a thought that I had.
Does that mean a price on carbon is a little bit of a better option? What is the level?
I have members that support that and I have members that oppose that. Thank you for that question.
So I don't mind.
And I'm in that same boat.
Are you really?
I have members that support it.
I think you need to price the externality in some way. It doesn't have to be a price on carbon. I mean, it can be. I think that's a very efficient way of doing it. And I live in this area of the country that's decided to do that. So I feel more, less constrained to talk about that. So I think putting a price on carbon is a very efficient way of doing it. I think the problem is we've got a long way to go in terms of really putting a price on carbon if we want to get the change that we're looking for. So even in the areas of the country that have embraced that model, we're still doing other things on the side. And I think the problem with other things on the side is that it really does end up creating a difficulty for the wholesale market to be able to predict that and monetize it and so forth. So if you want, I don't think you have to abandon the free market principle in wholesale electricity markets in order to achieve another objective, which is to move the system towards lower carbon emissions. One just needs to do it in a way that is predictable, easily understood, and values the attribute, and then the market will be able to monetize it. They'll build it into their business plans, and you'll create stability going forward. And I think that's the thing I'm really advocating for. I think that's a way to sort of make these two things live in harmony side by side.
Yeah, I agree. We need to know what we're planning for. I mean, in my organization, we have a 10-year transmission planning expansion process, and trying to keep up with what the individual state mandates are and trying to look in your crystal ball and understand what's coming down from Washington. I mean, we don't know what to plan for today. I mean, even if we utilize more probable scenarios, the more probable scenarios change. We have states that had mandated percentages for renewables, and then they went back and repealed that and changed it to guidelines. Well, what does that mean? And that's the biggest issue with markets. It's not how do you send the right price signals. We just need stability so that we know what to plan for.
Who else do we have out there with a question? See anybody? Over there in the corner. Yeah, got it.
Movement.
Thank you. In regards to integrating distributed energy resources.
Can you identify yourself? Sorry.
Sure. Dan Seif from the Butler firm. In regards to integrating distributed energy resources into ISO and RTO operations, it is indeed quite challenging. It's actively involved. I'm going here in ERCOT in Texas with an initiative called DREAM. But I think the conversation is often at the level of sort of what is the right policy pace, and by policy I mean often standard ISO rules which govern all ISOs everywhere. You know, in each ISO. Every ISO has a stakeholding working groups that develop rules. That is uniform. That's how ISOs run. So you can't have ISOs without those rules. The pace of that, but there is an end game where the decision is no longer amongst the ISO. Solar City is already offering self-supply solar systems with batteries, hot water heaters, and control systems at $450 a watt and solar. What happened in 6, 7, 8, 9 years? Was that $2.50 a watt, $2 a watt, $1.50 a watt? They can do self-supply and do substantial load defection where they're not participating in wholesale markets. They're responding to the signal at the retail level, and that's their market, the home level. And there's no policy at a PUC that's going to work against that when you're just doing pure play efficiency and using your own solar power and no sales to the grid. So there is an end story that nobody wants because that self-supply model is definitely not efficient, and market participation is. So how do you sort of pace so that doesn't occur, still realizing all the challenges that you both gentlemen mentioned, which are very true?
Thank you. Gordon, you want to?
Well, I think if that's a self-supply model, I'm fine with it actually. So if the combination of solar panels and local storage is more economic than pulling power off the grid, go for it. And that doesn't trouble me because I think that that's then the right economic decision. I think we're already starting to see some of that, but it's happening because it's being subsidized at this point. And we're going to see demand drop off, go flat and negative in New England. But that even doesn't trouble me because I look at the long-range picture and I say, well, hang on. We've got to reduce carbon emissions by 80% economy-wide by 2050, right? So think about that. You've got to take it out of the generation sector. You've got to take it out of transportation. You've got to take it out of heating. It gets really cold in New England, and how do we heat our homes? It's with oil and gas. So to me, the path forward then is more renewable energy. The grid is going to be the most efficient way to move that energy around the system. So I think in the long run, there's lots of opportunity.
Who's paying for the grid when you get substantial load defection?
Well, so I think that's the policy question that has to be faced up to because, you know, I've sort of watched this discussion play out around the country and the focus and the battles around solar PV and so forth, and it's about who's paying for the utility wire, the distribution wire, right? And I think that's a valid discussion. But I think there's another part of this, which is, hang on, the wire is useless to you unless you have a system of resources connected on the other side of the wire. So who's paying for that system of resources? So I think the path we're on in many cases isn't a sustainable model. So at some point, there's a day of reckoning where we have to get alignment between these policies in order to ensure the reliability that we're looking for. Because the reality of a lot of this distributed resource is very weather dependent. And if we can offer our consumers this free option to sort of pull on the giant battery in the sky whenever they need it, somebody has to pay for it. And I think that's a conversation that we're not yet having.
And there are regulatory filings at the state level in our footprint to deal with that very issue. Who pays for the infrastructure, the grid? It's going to be interesting to watch the outcome of those.
Any other questions out there? I've got one. So let's say we come back here for ETS 2021. And the four of you have a misfortune to be sitting with me up here, you know, Groundhog Day, 5 years from now. Is the conversation going to look vastly different? And if so, what might be the major deltas between today and 5 years out? And want to have a shot at that?
Oh, I think 10 years ago, we managed a predominantly thermal fleet with a few renewable resources. 5 years from now, we're probably going to be managing a predominantly renewable fleet with a few thermal resources to help us manage that balancing act. And I believe all of our markets are going to be heavily involved on the demand side of the equation, so much more so than we are today.
What about your world, Todd, 5 years from now?
Yeah, I would hope that we would still have a system that encourages, rather than maybe finding a way to price carbon, that encourages individual companies to find a better way to deliver their product and lowering their carbon footprint in doing so. I think that's going to be a key to encourage that individual innovation among our companies and finding better and newer ways, newer technology, newer and better ways to deliver that product. I think that's going to be the key to maintaining our security as a nation. That's very important.
Gordon?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be an accelerated state over where we are today. I think the genie's out of the bottle. We're not putting it back on either giving customers choice, and by implication, if you're going to give customers choice, you have to have markets to be able to allow for that. I mean, the only way you put the genie back in the bottle from a market point of view is to remove choice from the customer ultimately. So I think you can't, those two things are opposite sides of the same coin. The other thing, I think the genie's out of the bottle and is going to be very hard to put back, is the trend towards renewable energy. I look at my kids. I have a 27-year-old and a 29-year-old. They are willing to pay more for their energy because they want it green. And so I think if I look at the sort of the generations ahead of us, I think that's an unstoppable trend. And so I think we're going to be solving those problems as we go along.
And Mike, solar 5 years ago was barely a blip. No one really even talked about it 5 or 6 years ago. Now we're talking about the digitization of all this stuff. And really, that whole big data conversation has emerged just on the public consciousness, the regulatory consciousness, the last couple of years. 5 years from now, is everybody like, oh yeah, digitized energy? Of course, you know, why wouldn't you talk about it? Is it that pervasive in the public consciousness by then?
5 years a little short, and I'm a jaded participant from where we started 2000. 5 years from now, what smart grid will look like.
Yeah.
This will be the third 5-year iteration. So I'm a little
Keeps us
nervous.
young. Yeah.
But I think that all of that complexity of what goes on into the grid is going to be moving further and further back in obscurity. Not that it won't be there, but the consumer doesn't care about digitizing the grid. They don't care about the complexities that we've introduced. They just want it to work and they want option. I think 5 years from now, whether it's to address the Solar City model, who's going to pay for it, you're going to see market participation at the consumer level and not in the way we think about markets today. Markets today, wholesale markets, big participation markets, aggregation market, I think you'll see, and New York is a state that is potentially driving this. You're going to see that market participation extends for energy all the way down to the consumer. At what percent of penetration that'll be in 5 years, maybe not pervasive, but it will be the path that we're going down. And it won't be the consumer looking at my market participation with my utility. It'll be the consumer looking at market participation across the energy spectrum.
Peter, I think the one thing I'm sure of is that markets and transactive energy at the distribution level is going to take much longer than people think. So we've been at wholesale markets for 2 decades, and we've still got a myriad problems that we're trying to solve. So
Yeah.
I think what's happening at the distribution level is very early days. So, you'd have to invite us back in 2035 to have that conversation, I think.
I'm game for it if you all are. And with that, we're out of time. So I want to thank you all on the panel for a great conversation. I certainly learned a lot. I hope you all did out there as well, and thank you.
Such a deal.